At least I'm not the one who ended up alone. Ryan said it with a smile that drew laughter from the long banquet table, the crystal chandeliers above reflecting light across polished marble floors and champagne flutes that cost more than Emily's first month of rent after the divorce. The country club ballroom smelled like white roses and expensive cologne, a curated celebration of his engagement to someone younger, brighter, carefully chosen to match his rising executive title. Emily stood near the edge of the room, fingers wrapped around the thin stem of her untouched glass, the condensation slipping slowly against her skin. She hadn't planned to come, but declining would have looked bitter, and she refused to be anything that resembled regret. Ryan adjusted his cufflinks as if punctuating the joke, glancing at her just long enough to make sure she heard it. Still no husband. Still alone. The words weren't shouted, but they traveled easily across the room, carried by polite laughter and the clink of silverware against china. Emily felt the weight of a dozen quiet stares, the kind that measure a woman's worth by the ring on her finger. She offered a small, composed smile, the kind that revealed nothing. 5 years ago, she had stood beside Ryan in a modest apartment barely 800 square feet, drafting business plans at a kitchen counter that wobbled every time the dishwasher ran. She remembered late nights with takeout cartons and spreadsheets, the blue glow of a borrowed laptop lighting his determined face. She believed in him before anyone else did. She believed enough for both of them. Somewhere between his first promotion and the purchase of their suburban house, with its oversized driveway and manicured lawn, belief turned into something else. He began speaking in sharper tones, measuring success in square footage and social circles. She became background noise. When he filed for divorce, he called it different visions. She called it silence. Now, in this ballroom lined with gold-trimmed mirrors, he stood taller, rehearsed and confident, announcing to the room how grateful he was to have found the right partner this time. Laughter again. Emily set her glass down on a passing tray before the stem could snap under the quiet pressure of her grip. She straightened her shoulders, smoothing the navy fabric of her dress, simple but precise, chosen not to impress but to reflect who she had become, steady, self-contained. Ryan's eyes flicked back to her, searching for a reaction, maybe a crack in her composure that would confirm his version of the story. He found none. What he didn't notice was the calm in her gaze. Not the calm of defeat. The calm of someone who no longer waits to be chosen. The band began to play a soft instrumental version of a love song she once danced to in their living room, barefoot on hardwood floors before success rewrote their vows. Emily turned toward the exit, heels quiet against marble, the night air beyond the tall glass doors waiting cool and open. Behind her, laughter swelled again around Ryan's polished toast, but she didn't look back. She didn't need to. Some exits are not about escape. They are about timing. And Ryan Mitchell had just made the first mistake of underestimating the woman who once built his future beside him. The night air outside the country club felt different from the polished warmth inside, cooler by at least 10 degrees, carrying the faint scent of trimmed grass and distant rain. Emily paused at the top of the wide stone steps, the city lights stretching beyond the gated property like a quiet reminder that the world was larger than one ballroom, larger than one man's laughter. She slipped her heels off for a moment, pressing her bare feet against the cool limestone, grounding herself before walking toward the parking lot where her modest sedan waited between rows of imported luxury vehicles. 5 years ago, she would have measured her worth against those cars, against the diamond on another woman's hand, against the applause that followed Ryan's promotions. Tonight, she measured it by something else entirely. The drive back to her apartment took 32 minutes without traffic. She kept the radio off. The silence was not heavy. It was deliberate. Streetlights flashed rhythmically across her windshield, each one like a quiet checkpoint between who she had been and who she was becoming. Her apartment was just under 900 square feet, 3rd floor, no elevator, exposed brick along one wall that caught the morning sun in a way she had grown to love. She set her keys down in the ceramic bowl by the door, the one she bought herself the week the divorce was finalized. No shared decisions, no compromises, just a small object that belonged entirely to her. In the kitchen, a legal pad lay open on the counter beside her laptop. Numbers filled the page in neat, steady handwriting. Revenue projections, expansion ideas, A product roadmap she had rewritten 3 times until it no longer resembled the early drafts she once sketched for Ryan's company. That first business plan had been built at a wobbly kitchen table with a second-hand chair. She remembered the night he received his first investor call, how he had lifted her off the ground in celebration, promising they would always be a team. Somewhere along the climb, he stopped saying we and started saying I. Emily poured herself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, replaying his joke in the ballroom. It no longer stung the way he probably intended. It revealed more about him than it did about her. Alone was a word he used as an insult. To her, it had become a workshop, a laboratory, a place where she could think without interruption. She walked to her desk by the window and opened her laptop. An unread email sat at the top of her inbox from a venture capital firm she had met with the week before. The subject line was brief and neutral, but her pulse shifted anyway. She did not open it yet. Instead, she reviewed her latest draft presentation, adjusting a sentence here, tightening a number there. Precision had replaced apology in her vocabulary. Outside, a siren echoed faintly 3 blocks away, then faded. The city moved on. So did she. Ryan believed the absence of a husband defined her future. He had mistaken a pause for an ending. Emily closed her laptop gently, not out of defeat, but out of timing. Some foundations are built quietly, long before anyone recognizes the skyline they will become. Morning arrived gently through the exposed brick wall, sunlight stretching in narrow golden lines across the hardwood floor and stopping just short of Emily's desk. She woke before her alarm, not out of restlessness but habit, the kind formed when no one else's schedule dictates your own. The apartment was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rhythm of traffic 3 floors below. She brewed coffee in a small stainless steel pot, measuring the grounds carefully, the aroma filling the kitchen with something warm and grounding. 5 years ago, mornings began with Ryan's phone buzzing before sunrise, emails flooding in, conversations about targets and bonuses, and who had outperformed whom. She used to sit at the edge of their king-sized bed, watching him scroll through numbers, waiting for him to notice she was there. Now, she noticed herself. She carried her mug to the desk by the window and opened her laptop, the screen illuminating spreadsheets she had refined long after midnight. The unread email from the venture capital firm still waited at the top of her inbox. She studied the sender's name for a moment, steadying her breath, then clicked. The message was concise, professional, direct. They were interested in a second meeting. They wanted to review her revised projections and discuss potential partnership terms. There were no promises, only possibility, but possibility was more than she had been offered in years. She did not smile widely. She did not whisper gratitude to the empty room. Instead, she opened her calendar and scheduled preparation blocks in precise 2-hour segments. Discipline over excitement. Focus over fantasy. After breakfast, she changed into a tailored ivory blouse and charcoal slacks, clothing chosen not for attention but for alignment. The mirror above her dresser reflected a woman who no longer asked whether she was enough. The answer was already embedded in the way she stood. She spent the late morning at a co-working space 12 blocks away, a renovated warehouse with high ceilings and long wooden tables where entrepreneurs typed quietly under industrial lights. Conversations floated softly about funding rounds and software updates, but Emily remained anchored in her own documents. She refined her market analysis, anticipating questions before they could be asked. She had once helped build someone else's empire from behind a curtain. This time, there would be no curtain. Around noon, her phone lit up with a notification. A social media post from a mutual acquaintance. A photo from the engagement party the night before. Ryan stood centered in the frame, arm around his fiancée, captioned with congratulations and applause emojis. Emily glanced at it for less than 3 seconds before locking her screen. The image no longer had authority over her mood. What unsettled her years ago now felt distant, like an old headline no one reads anymore. She returned to her presentation, adjusting a slide title from growth strategy to scalable expansion. Words mattered. Ownership mattered. By late afternoon, the sun shifted across the warehouse windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Emily closed her laptop with deliberate calm. She had not responded to the world with noise. She had responded with progress. Ryan believed success was something displayed under chandeliers. Emily understood it often began under fluorescent lights, in rooms where no one applauded. And somewhere between the quiet click of her keyboard and the steady rhythm of her breathing, a new chapter was positioning itself, patient and unseen, waiting for the right moment to step into the light. The conference room on the 32nd floor overlooked downtown, glass walls framing a skyline that shimmered in late morning light, each building rising with the kind of confidence that only comes from foundations poured deep and steady. Emily arrived 10 minutes early, leather portfolio tucked under her arm, heels measured and quiet against polished concrete floors. The receptionist offered water or coffee. She chose water, her voice even, her posture relaxed but intentional. She had reviewed every slide twice before leaving her apartment, refining margins, tightening language, eliminating anything that sounded uncertain. When the partners from the venture capital firm entered, their suits were tailored, their expressions practiced. They did not smile broadly, and she did not expect them to. Respect, she had learned, was rarely announced. It was earned in small increments. She began her presentation without embellishment, outlining the market gap she had identified, the data supporting her projections, the operational strategy that would allow scalability without compromising quality. Her voice did not rush. She paused where clarity required space. Questions came, measured and precise. She welcomed them, answering without defensiveness, occasionally turning to a slide she had prepared specifically for potential objections. Years ago, she had sat beside Ryan in rooms like this, whispering insights that he would later repeat as his own. She remembered the subtle shift in body language when investors leaned forward, intrigued. Back then, she felt pride in his spotlight. Today, she stood in her own. An hour passed without her noticing the clock. By the time the final slide faded from the screen, the room had grown quieter, not from doubt, but from consideration. One of the senior partners leaned back, fingers steepled, and asked what had prompted her to build this venture independently. Emily held his gaze steadily. She did not mention divorce. She did not reference humiliation or absence. She simply said that she had recognized an opportunity and believed she was the right person to execute it. The answer settled between them, simple and sufficient. When the meeting concluded, they did not offer immediate commitments. Instead, they spoke of next steps, due diligence, timelines measured in weeks rather than days. She thanked them, gathered her portfolio, and stepped back into the hallway where sunlight filtered through tinted glass. In the elevator descending 32 floors, she allowed herself one slow exhale. Not relief. Alignment. Her phone vibrated softly in her hand as the doors opened onto the lobby. An unknown number flashed across the screen. She hesitated for half a second before answering. The voice on the other end was calm, distinct, confident without arrogance. He introduced himself as Alexander Hayes and mentioned that he had reviewed a summary of her proposal through a mutual contact at the firm. He asked if she would be open to a brief conversation later that week. There was no rush in his tone, no presumption, only curiosity. Emily glanced at her reflection in the polished steel doors, catching a glimpse of the woman she had become through quiet persistence. She agreed to schedule a call. Outside, traffic moved steadily along the avenue. Taxis weaving between black sedans, the city unaware of the subtle shift that had just occurred. Ryan once believed doors opened because he pushed them. Emily was beginning to understand that some doors opened because she had built something worth entering. The call was scheduled for Thursday at 4:15 in the afternoon, a time Emily chose deliberately, late enough to finish her own work, early enough to speak with a clear mind. She took it from her apartment rather than the co-working space, preferring the quiet certainty of exposed brick and familiar light. At exactly 4:15, her phone rang. Alexander Hayes did not waste words on small talk. His voice carried the calm cadence of someone accustomed to being heard without raising it. He thanked her for taking the time and mentioned that he had reviewed her executive summary twice. Not skimmed, reviewed. He asked questions that moved beyond surface metrics, questions about long-term positioning, about how she would protect the integrity of the brand if rapid growth tested its foundation. Emily sat at her desk, a legal pad open, pen poised but rarely needed. She had lived inside these answers for months. She explained her phased expansion model, her hiring philosophy, the importance of building culture before scaling headcount beyond 25 employees. There was a pause on the other end, not empty but thoughtful. He said he appreciated that she was not chasing speed for the sake of headlines. That observation settled differently than praise. It felt like recognition. After 27 minutes, he shifted the conversation. He told her that while the venture capital firm was still conducting due diligence, he was personally interested in exploring a strategic partnership, not as a controlling investor, as an ally. The word lingered. Ally suggested collaboration rather than ownership. Years ago, she would have felt a reflexive caution, the instinct formed after watching ambition reshape someone she loved. Now, she measured tone more than title. Alexander did not speak over her. He did not assume she needed saving. He asked what she required to accelerate without compromising standards. Emily glanced around her apartment, at the modest furniture she had chosen piece by piece, at the framed blueprint of her company logo leaning against the wall. She told him she required capital, yes, but also access to infrastructure and mentorship at scale. She did not soften her ambition. Silence followed, brief and steady. Then he said he believed those were reasonable terms and suggested meeting in person the following week at his office. Not a restaurant, not a public spectacle, a workspace. After the call ended, Emily remained seated for a moment, phone resting face down on the desk. Her reflection appeared faintly in the darkened screen, eyes clear, shoulders relaxed. She did not interpret the conversation as destiny. She interpreted it as alignment between preparation and opportunity. Outside, a delivery truck double parked along the curb, engine idling, a reminder that the world continued its ordinary rhythm regardless of quiet breakthroughs. She stood, walked to the kitchen, and poured herself a glass of water. The city skyline beyond her window reflected late afternoon light, buildings outlined in gold as the sun began its descent. Ryan once believed power was something displayed in public announcements and curated photographs. Emily was discovering that real power often introduced itself quietly, through a measured voice on the other end of a phone line, asking how it could build beside her rather than above her. Advisory team. The numbers were substantial, measured in millions rather than thousands. But what steadied her was the structure. She would retain controlling interest. Decisions would remain hers. He was not offering to replace her authority. He was reinforcing it. They discussed timelines, operational milestones, the hiring of a chief financial officer once revenue crossed a specific threshold. The conversation felt less like negotiation and more like calibration. After 90 minutes, they stood. He walked her to the elevator himself, a gesture small but intentional. As they waited for the doors to open, he said quietly that he respected how she carried herself, that strength did not need volume. Emily met his eyes, recognizing something familiar in the composure there. The elevator descended, city skyline rising into view through the glass wall. When she stepped onto the sidewalk, the late afternoon sun warmed her shoulders. She did not feel rescued. She felt recognized. And somewhere across town, in an office where titles mattered more than substance, Ryan remained unaware that the foundation beneath his confidence was about to feel very small. 3 weeks later, the first wire transfer cleared just after 9:30 in the morning, the confirmation email arriving while Emily stood at the long wooden table in the co-working space that had witnessed her earliest drafts. The number on the screen carried more zeros than anything she had ever managed, but she did not stare at it for long. Instead, she opened a new document labeled Phase 1 Implementation and began assigning timelines measured in weeks and deliverables measured in precision. By noon, she had scheduled interviews with 2 operations managers and a financial consultant recommended by Alexander's advisory team. The partnership had been formalized quietly, contracts signed in a private conference room with no photographers and no announcement blasted across headlines. Growth, she believed, did not require spectacle. It required structure. Across town, in a corner office framed by certificates and industry awards, Ryan reviewed a company-wide email that shifted the trajectory of his own career. The subject line announced a strategic acquisition and restructuring initiative led by Alexander Hayes. Ryan read the name twice, the letters settling with an unfamiliar weight. He had heard of Alexander, of course. Everyone in their sector had. A man known for disciplined expansion and decisive leadership. The email detailed new oversight protocols, performance evaluations, and a leadership summit, scheduled for the end of the quarter. Ryan adjusted his tie and leaned back in his chair, calculating what this meant for his department. Influence, he had learned, could shift without warning. Meanwhile, Emily met with her newly hired operations manager in a sunlit office suite she had leased just 2 blocks from the river. The space was modest but intentional, 1,200 square feet with glass partitions and clean white walls waiting to be filled with strategy rather than decoration. She outlined expectations clearly, emphasizing accountability and transparency. She did not mimic the authoritative tone she once heard in Ryan's voice. She chose steadiness instead. Later that afternoon, Alexander stopped by unannounced, not with fanfare, but with a quiet knock on the glass door. He observed the layout, asked thoughtful questions about workflow, and introduced himself to the small team without referencing his own status. There was no performative leadership, only presence. When he and Emily stood side by side reviewing a projection board, their conversation centered on logistics and long-term positioning, not on personal narratives. Respect built itself in shared focus. As the sun lowered behind the skyline, casting long reflections across the river, Emily felt the subtle shift of momentum beneath her feet. She was no longer drafting plans in borrowed spaces. She was executing them in rooms she controlled. Ryan, unaware of how closely their professional paths were beginning to align, prepared slides for the upcoming leadership summit, determined to impress the new executive oversight. He rehearsed his talking points in the mirror of his office, confident in his experience, certain that his past achievements would secure his place. What he did not know was that the architecture of power around him was being redesigned, quietly and deliberately, by the very man who had chosen to invest in the woman he once underestimated. And Emily, standing in her own office as the lights flickered on one by one across the city, understood that timing was no longer something she waited for. It was something she was building. The leadership summit was scheduled for a Friday afternoon in a downtown hotel ballroom overlooking the river, 500 chairs arranged in precise rows beneath suspended crystal fixtures that scattered light across polished floors. Ryan arrived early, presentation saved on a slim silver laptop, confidence pressed into the crease of his tailored suit. He greeted colleagues with measured enthusiasm, shaking hands, adjusting his cufflinks, positioning himself near the front where senior management would sit. The atmosphere carried the low murmur of ambition, conversations about quarterly performance and restructuring strategies floating through the air like carefully rehearsed promises. At exactly 2 o'clock, the lights dimmed slightly and the stage screens illuminated with the company logo, followed by a single name in bold lettering, Alexander Hayes. Applause rose as he walked onto the stage, composed and unhurried, acknowledging the room with a brief nod rather than a wide smile. Ryan clapped along with everyone else, studying the man who now directed the future of his department. Alexander spoke about efficiency, about sustainable growth, about recalibrating leadership structures to align with long-term vision. His tone remained even, his words deliberate. Midway through the presentation, he introduced a new strategic partner whose division would play a central role in the company's expansion. The slide behind him shifted, revealing a brand logo unfamiliar to most in the audience, but quietly gaining influence in the market. Ryan leaned forward slightly, scanning the screen, unaware that he had once dismissed the mind behind that very brand. Alexander continued, explaining how this partner had demonstrated discipline, innovation, and resilience in building scalable infrastructure from the ground up. There was no embellishment, only facts arranged with precision. In the audience, Ryan felt a flicker of curiosity edged with something he could not yet name. On stage, Alexander concluded by announcing that the partner would join him for the closing session to outline collaborative initiatives for the upcoming fiscal year. The room responded with polite applause, executives exchanging looks of calculation and anticipation. Ryan straightened in his seat, already rehearsing how he might position himself advantageously during the networking reception that would follow. He did not know that the woman he once measured by her marital status was about to step into the same light he now sought. And somewhere beyond the heavy ballroom doors, in the quiet corridor where footsteps echoed against patterned carpet, Emily adjusted the sleeve of her tailored white blazer, steady as ever, prepared not to confront the past but to redefine the room. The ballroom doors opened without announcement, Just a quiet shift of air as Emily stepped inside, heels steady against patterned carpet, posture aligned with the calm she had practiced for years. Conversations softened not because they recognized her, but because Alexander turned toward the entrance, extending his hand in welcome before the room understood why. She crossed the space between them with measured composure, the white blazer catching light from the chandeliers, her expression neither defiant nor hesitant. Ryan felt it before he fully saw her, a subtle tightening in his chest as his gaze followed the direction of the room's attention. When he recognized her profile beneath the stage lights, memory collided with disbelief. This was not the woman who had stood silent at the edge of his engagement party. This was someone centered, deliberate, self-assured. Alexander introduced her by name, his tone even, explaining that her company would lead the integration strategy for the firm's next phase of expansion. The screen behind them displayed metrics and projections that Ryan immediately recognized as sophisticated, disciplined, undeniable. Applause filled the ballroom, not loud but sustained, the kind reserved for competence rather than spectacle. Emily stepped forward to the podium, fingers resting lightly on its edge, eyes scanning the audience without searching for any single face. She outlined the collaborative roadmap with clarity, speaking about scalable systems, accountability frameworks, and sustainable growth models. Her voice carried across the room without strain. Ryan remained seated in the third row, hands clasped together, processing the inversion unfolding before him. He had once reduced her future to a question of whether another man had chosen her. Now she stood aligned with the most powerful executive in the company he served, not as an accessory, but as a partner in strategy. When the presentation concluded, Alexander returned to her side. He did not dominate the moment or reclaim the spotlight. Instead, he said simply that true leadership recognized strength wherever it existed. The statement lingered in the air, subtle but precise. As the audience rose in applause once more, Emily allowed herself a small, composed smile. She did not look toward Ryan for validation or reaction. She did not need to witness his realization to understand its weight. Years ago, she had walked out of a ballroom alone, dismissed by laughter that echoed too loudly in her ears. Tonight, she stood in a different ballroom, under brighter lights, the architecture of her own resilience visible in every measured word she had spoken. She had not returned to prove him wrong. She had returned because she had built something undeniable. And as the applause faded into networking chatter and the future rearranged itself quietly around her, one truth remained steady. She did not win him back. She won herself. The applause dissolved into the low murmur of networking conversations, glasses clinking softly as executives recalibrated their alliances in real time. Emily stepped down from the stage beside Alexander, the weight of the moment settling not as triumph, but as confirmation. She had prepared for this room long before she entered it. A cluster of senior managers approached, offering measured congratulations, asking pointed questions about implementation timelines and integration phases. She answered each one with clarity, outlining 90-day benchmarks and quarterly review checkpoints without hesitation. Across the ballroom, Ryan remained momentarily still before rising from his seat, smoothing the front of his jacket as if composure could be pressed back into place. He joined the flow of executives moving toward the stage, expression controlled, eyes sharper than before. When he finally stood within conversational distance, there was a brief pause that carried years of unspoken history. Emily turned toward him with the same steady gaze she had offered investors and board members. There was no accusation in her expression, no invitation either. Only recognition of shared past and separate futures. Ryan extended his hand, voice even as he congratulated her on the partnership. The words were professional, carefully chosen. She accepted the handshake with equal restraint, her grip firm, her posture aligned. She thanked him without embellishment and introduced him to her newly appointed operations director standing nearby, shifting the focus immediately back to business. The exchange lasted less than 60 seconds, but within it the balance had shifted permanently. Alexander observed the interaction without interruption, then placed a subtle hand at the center of Emily's back as he guided her toward another group of executives awaiting discussion. The gesture was respectful, not possessive, signaling alignment rather than ownership. As the evening progressed, Strategic conversations replaced social pleasantries. Emily discussed expansion into 3 additional markets within the next 18 months, referencing data points that demonstrated both ambition and caution. Ryan listened from a short distance, absorbing the realization that her trajectory now intersected directly with his own performance metrics. She was no longer adjacent to power. She was part of its design. When the event concluded and guests began to filter toward the exits, city lights reflecting off the river beyond the ballroom windows, Emily paused near the entrance. She did not search for Ryan again. She did not measure whether he watched her leave. Years ago, she had walked away diminished in his narrative. Tonight, she walked away expanded in her own. The doors opened, cool night air meeting her steady breath, and for the first time the past felt not like a wound but like distance. The night after the summit unfolded quietly, without headlines or dramatic announcements, only the steady continuation of momentum. By Monday morning, internal communications confirmed the new integration task force, and Emily's company name appeared in formal documentation circulated across departments. Ryan read the memo at his desk, the language precise and unmistakable. Her division would oversee structural adjustments that directly affected his reporting line. He stared at the screen longer than necessary, aware that performance would now be evaluated against standards she had helped design. Across the river, sunlight streamed into Emily's office as she reviewed onboarding updates with her operations manager. She outlined expectations clearly, emphasizing collaboration rather than control. Authority, she understood, was most effective when it did not need to be displayed. Later that week, a joint strategy meeting was scheduled at corporate headquarters, a glass conference room suspended above the city like a transparent declaration of accountability. Ryan entered with a folder tucked under his arm, prepared, composed, determined not to appear unsettled. When Emily walked in alongside Alexander, the room adjusted almost imperceptibly. She took her seat at the head of the table not because she demanded it, but because the agenda listed her first. The discussion moved efficiently through milestones, resource allocation, and projected revenue alignment. Ryan presented his department's numbers with practiced confidence, careful to reference metrics that aligned with the new strategic direction. Emily listened without interruption, occasionally asking clarifying questions that revealed both knowledge and foresight. There was no hostility in her tone, only expectation. When he finished, she acknowledged the strengths in his plan and outlined 2 refinements that would increase efficiency by measurable percentages. The room nodded. The adjustment was logical, data-supported, difficult to dispute. Ryan agreed, voice steady, recognizing competence when it stood in front of him. The meeting concluded ahead of schedule, a rarity that signaled discipline rather than tension. As executives filtered out, Alexander paused beside Emily, discussing next quarter benchmarks in low, focused tones. Ryan gathered his materials, aware that the hierarchy he once navigated confidently had shifted in ways he had not anticipated. Outside the building, traffic moved steadily beneath the steel and glass towers, unaware of personal reckonings unfolding above. Emily remained seated for a moment after the room emptied, reviewing notes with calm precision. She had not sought to confront him. She had not orchestrated humiliation. She had built something substantial enough that proximity to her success became unavoidable. In the quiet hum of the conference room, with sunlight reflecting off polished surfaces, one truth settled clearly. Respect was no longer requested. It was assumed. Autumn arrived quietly, the air cooling by 10 degrees, leaves gathering along the sidewalks beneath towers of glass and steel. In Emily's office, floor-to-ceiling windows framed a skyline that now felt less intimidating and more familiar, as though the city had shifted from witness to participant in her evolution. Quarterly reports lay neatly arranged across the conference table, numbers trending upward with steady, sustainable growth. She reviewed them with calm attention, marking adjustments in blue ink, refining forecasts that once lived only in her notebooks. Across town, Ryan finalized his department's performance review submission, aware that its evaluation would pass through channels shaped in part by her strategy. He no longer viewed her success as a surprise. He viewed it as structure. That evening, a small executive reception gathered on the rooftop terrace of the headquarters building, a restrained celebration of the company's strongest quarter in 5 years. Soft lighting lined the perimeter, casting warm reflections against the river below. Emily stood near the railing, a tailored coat draped over her shoulders against the crisp air, listening as colleagues discussed expansion into 2 additional states by the end of the fiscal year. Alexander joined her without announcement, hands resting casually in his coat pockets. For a moment, neither spoke. The city lights shimmered across the water, steady and unhurried. He turned slightly toward her and said that partnerships were often tested by pressure and that she had proven hers resilient. She met his gaze, understanding that the statement reached beyond quarterly results. There was no grand declaration, no dramatic gesture, only alignment built through months of shared discipline and respect. When Ryan approached later, glass of sparkling water in hand, his tone carried professionalism unclouded by past arrogance. He acknowledged the transformation within the company and the role she had played in it. There was no bitterness in his words, only recognition. Emily listened, nodding once, her response measured and courteous. The exchange did not reopen old chapters. It closed them. As the evening drew to a close and executives filtered toward the elevators, Emily remained by the railing for a final moment, breathing in the cool air. Years ago, she had been defined by absence, by what she did not have. Tonight, she stood defined by what she had built, by the quiet architecture of self-respect and earned authority. She did not need applause to validate her path. She did not need comparison to confirm her worth. Beneath the wide American sky, lights stretching for miles in every direction, she understood with steady certainty that the most powerful victory had never been about status or marriage. It had been about becoming a woman who no longer required permission to rise.